Okay, hello everybody. Our share today is titled Halachic Fiction and ex post facto justification in the modern halachic process. And I based myself on the research by Professor Mark Shapiro, who, as you know, I regard as one of the most important contemporary rabbis today. And we're going to look at the idea of a halachic fiction. And what is a halachic fiction? It's used to describe certain legal constructs in halakha that are not literally true, but they still serve as mechanisms to reconcile the demands of halakha with the realities of what's called lived experience. Real life experiences sometimes inform halakha, but the mechanism that's used to transform those real life experiences and those real life difficulties that we have sometimes in applying the halakha, those mechanisms are what Shapiro calls halachic fictions. And we find this particularly in the post-Shulchan Aruch period, because from the 16th century, when Rabbi Yosef Karo produces his Shulchan Aruch, we now have official codified law. We had other codes before from Rambam and other people, but the official Shulchan Aruch signifies the beginning of the final redaction, the final codification of halakha. Of course, it's not absolute, but it's as absolute as you can get in terms of halakha. So halachic fictions become particularly interesting in the post-Shulchan Aruch period, where we shouldn't need to have any halachic fictions because we already have codified law. And we're going to look at what Jacob Katz, the historian, refers to as the community's ritual instinct, which often determines halakha. And we're going to go into this, but that expression is a very interesting expression. Morning Morgan and morning to Shmonya. That the expression of a community's ritual instinct is fascinating because it shows how the communal instinct, what people feel is right, what people feel should be right, might not necessarily be halachically correct, but the communal ritual instinct and their custom determines the law, sometimes to a greater extent than the rabbis themselves. In other words, there's a certain power that's given over to the people that often is more powerful than the power of the rabbis in determining halakha, practical halakha. So I want to quote to you from Moshe Halbertal, who writes as follows. He speaks about the idea that he takes from Jacob Katz, the idea of the community's ritual instinct. And what does he say? He says as follows: the community creates norms organically. This we know, this is what a community does. It does create laws organically with time. They're natural. But it creates these laws without negotiation with the rabbinical authority. That's why they're organic. They're just produced in the community. The community produces its own ritual, its own laws. There's a community spirit almost that determines what the halacha should be or what the appropriate halacha should be. This instinct, this ritual instinct is there. And sometimes on the basis, I continue now with Halbertal, on the basis of advice received from educated dilettantes. It's quite an interesting expression. A dilettante is an amateur. So every community has got their amateur halachic posek, their go-to person who they go to determine the correct practices that are appropriate for that particular community. They're not necessarily trained halachists, not that I'm quite sure what that term means, but they are dilettantes, they are wannabes, they are self-proclaimed authorities in the community that set the standards for the community. And we shouldn't underestimate this, because every community has them. And these voices are strong voices, and very often these voices determine halachic practice. After the norms, these norms that the dilettantes introduce have been rooted, the halachic authorities now say, oh my goodness, look what people are doing in the community, or we're hearing in this community they're doing this, in this one they're doing that. Then the halachic authorities step in afterwards, and they examine these new contributions in institutions, halachic institutions, customs that have been brought in by the communal instinct. So the halachic authorities now start to examine them in light of their legal sources. They take out their books and they determine, well, is this practice really okay or is it not? And sometimes they consent to the norms ex post facto. In other words, they're not really happy with it, but they see that it's rooted in the community. It's coming from a good space. It's not so terrible. It might not be exactly what we want it to be. So they sometimes consent to these norms. Sometimes they reject them. And other times, and this is what we're going to focus on, they reinterpret the halachic sources to make them fit the norms that have been created. So that's a quote from Moshe Halbertal. In other words, what we see from this, and it's quite important that the practices that are formed by the communal instinct are either accepted. One of three things happen. They're either accepted by the halachic authorities, by the rabbis. They're accepted as permissible halakha, or they reject it. In other words, they say, no, what you're doing is clearly against halakha. Or, and this is what we're going to focus on, they're not really entirely happy with these practices, but they reconcile them to halakha. They make them fit in, and they create what Shapiro calls a halachic fiction, a basis that has no real textual basis, but it has a kind of a quasi halachic basis. It's a halachic fiction, like a legal fiction. And this means that in our era today, after the 16th century, once the Shulchan Aruch had been already publicized, we're going to see that these legal fictions, these laws created by communities, often override what is written in the Shulchan Aruch. And yet, the halachic poskim, the halachic authorities, the decisors of Jewish law, turn a blind eye to the written text of the Shulchan Aruch and create legal fictions supposedly connected to halachic principles and even Talmudic principles, and turn those retroactively, ex post facto, turn those into halakha, permissible halakha. But its source was not with the halachic authority. Its source was in the communal instincts of the community. The community suddenly decided to do certain things. Sometimes they neglected things, and the negligence became permissible, as we will see with some of our examples. So the communities have a very strong voice in determining halakha, and this is even more surprising in the era after the Shulchan Aruch, where we're supposed to have a codified halakha. We've got a book. You open up a book. Obviously, we don't always go by what's written in the Shulchan Aruch because there are different interpretations. But I'm saying generally it is the go-to book, and we shouldn't have a communal instinct having such a strong voice from a halachic point of view. Yet we do, and it's justified very much by halacha or by halachic fictions. So let's look now at what halachic fiction is. And before we do that, we need to look at what a legal fiction is in secular law. So here is a definition from a legal dictionary. A legal fiction is a secular, a non-Jewish legal dictionary defining what a legal fiction is. And it is as follows, I quote, "An assertion accepted as true, though probably fictitious, to achieve a particular goal in a legal matter." Right. So you're starting out, you want to achieve a certain legal goal. You want to come to a legal conclusion. You can't come to that conclusion by regular law. So you have to make an assertion, a legal assertion, that's most of the time not really factual, it's fictitious, but that fiction provides the mechanism for your outcome to be considered legal. An example of this is a corporation in secular law. A corporation is a body or a group. It's not a person. Yet, a corporation can enter into contracts. It can buy and sell. You can be sued by a corporation, even though it's not a person. So applying the idea of a person to a corporation so that you can allow yourself to collect money, to buy and sell, to sue, etc., that comparison of the corporation to a person becomes a legal fiction, because it is a fiction, because a corporation is not a person. Corporation can't really buy. It's the people who buy. But to make it legal, we rely on the legal fiction. Now, Mark Shapiro maintains that we have a lot of examples like this in Judaism. So he coins the phrase legal fiction, and he suggests it's no different from a legal fiction. It's exactly the same thing. We rely on something that's not entirely factual to arrive at a halachic outcome that we desire, but it's fictitious and it's legal. So a couple of his examples are Isar Chometz before Pesach. Everybody knows, and yes, we know that everyone tells us that it's a 100% legal sale, even by the standards of civil, non-Jewish or secular law in your country. It's binding, it's a proper sale. Yes, we know this, but you forget to conclude the sentence by saying that you're going through this whole thing in order to cancel it anyway and go back so that you don't really have to sell your chometz. So we're relying on, according to Shapiro, obviously a lot of people would argue that the halachic mechanism is fine, and it is fine, but one has to call it what it is. It is a legal fiction. A proof bull is another example. Proof bull is, debts are supposed to be cancelled in a sabbatical year. So, people would start borrowing money just before the end of the period and just before we come into this sabbatical year, and thinking, well, now their debts will be cancelled. So it's a great time to start borrowing money. And the economy that observed these laws started suffering as a result of people abusing the system. So Hillel the Elder came up with the notion of a proof bull, which you could term also, Shapiro certainly terms it as a legal fiction as well, because you're doing something that you shouldn't really do, but you need to do it. And yes, it's still okay halachically, but it's a legal fiction because you're still going against something that the Torah says that all debts are cancelled. and you're relying on a halachic fiction. And Eruv is another such example. Eruv, you're not allowed to carry on Shabbos, so we construct a boundary with a piece of string, a wire, around the city or around an area, and we merge private domains and public domains, and involve all sorts of technicalities when it comes to domains. And at the end of the day, we're allowed to carry on Shabbat in a place that we normally wouldn't be allowed to carry. Again, Shapiro terms this as a legal fiction, or regards this as another example of a legal fiction. But I think what we need to do before we continue with this discussion is we need to make a clear distinction, a very clear distinction between what you might want to call the legitimate halachic process, where you actually become a technocrat, a legal technocrat. You rely on laws. You actually look at the laws and how the law is structured. And you use the law. You don't manipulate it. You don't create fictions, but you actually use the law. And if something's not stipulated, then you can say, well, then you can have another outcome. But there is a legitimate halachic process which a legal mind would be able to use in a perfectly legitimate way without relying on legal fictions. Often you do have to rely on legal fiction, but I'm saying that there is a process. There's a regular halachic process that we should not confuse with the process of a halachic fiction. Sometimes you can use law as it is, as reality, without creating these fictions. And without having, especially this is what we're going to speak about now, legal fictions are often used not to create the law, but they're used to justify the law once the law has been abandoned or practices have been abandoned, to suddenly now make them permissible. As we'll see in some of our examples, we rely, or the halachists rely, on legal fictions, halachic fictions, ex post facto. In other words, once they see that people are already doing something that they shouldn't be doing, so you can't punish an entire community. So you've got to somehow bring that practice into the legal framework. I mean, no rabbi wants to see his community breaking laws, but often the rabbi would understand that he's fighting the societal pressures of his community and wouldn't want to be alienated from them. So often a blind eye is turned, but a legal fiction is more than a blind eye, because a blind eye would almost be like a rejection, but you're turning a blind eye to it. A legal fiction is where you condone it retroactively, say, well, once you're doing that, okay, it's not so bad. And that's the notion of a legal fiction. So I'm just trying to suggest that there is a difference between a legitimate halachic process and a perhaps slightly less legitimate, although not necessarily an illegal process of legal fiction or halachic fiction. Let me quote to you from Shapiro, because he puts this quite nicely. He says, we are confronted with nothing less than a de facto abolishment of the explicit Talmudic halachot. Shapiro is not in favor of legal fiction. In this sense, I think he's a purist. You've either got something that's halacha, it's pure halacha, and he's not happy with the notion of the Jewish world today using so much legal fiction to do things, or to permit things that really should not be permitted. So that's why he says we're confronted with nothing less than a de facto abolishment of explicit Talmudic halachot. That's what's happening in the Jewish world. Things that the Talmudic speaks about and says shouldn't be done are being permitted. Although for understandable reasons, says Shapiro, the halachas never uses such language. So he cuts straight to the chase. This is what I really admire about Shapiro. He says the Poskim today use this all the time to permit things that shouldn't be permitted, but they'll never admit it. They'll say, no, they are following what I was trying to describe earlier. They are following the legitimate halachic protocols. But in fact, they're not, because they're going into a retroactive cancellation of even Talmudic law through their halachic fictions. So from this perspective, says Shapiro, the halachas must portray any changes in halachic practice as having been inherent in the system all along. So again, you'll never find a posek who'll admit that they're using a halachic fiction to retroactively permit something that shouldn't be permitted, especially that's something that's prohibited by the Talmud. So they'll always make it look as if these things were always there in the past. Nothing has changed. Halacha has never changed. They're simply applying halacha as they can to the current situation. We need to go into some examples so that we stop talking about theory and these ideas will become easier to understand. So let's look now at how some of these laws have changed over time and how they've been permitted by rabbis over time by retroactively relying on halachic fictions. So I'll start with an example. This is something that's noted by Rabbi Shalom Messas. He's a posek, a relatively modern posek. He passed away in 2003. So he is a modern posek. And he writes that we need to be aware of a very simple fact in Judaism that no one admits. And that is that, to a large extent, people determine halacha, sometimes to a greater extent than rabbis. Morning, Adam. There's the power to the people, in a sense. The rabbis inform law to a greater extent than the rabbis themselves. And he brings a case in point. He has a fascinating example. It's a case in the Rambam. According to the Rambam, in Mishnah Torah, according to Maimonides writes that the Jewish practice used to be, or is, in Maimonides' day, in culture, is that women wear veils, not just a kerchief or a sheitel, but they wear veils. So let me read to you where it says that in the Mishnah Torah. Rambam writes, these are the things that if a woman does one of these, if they transgress one of these things, Avra al dat Yehudit, she then transgresses Jewish law. And what is one of these things? So, Yatz'a lasuk, she goes out into the market, or lemavoy mefulash, or into a alleyway or a corridor that's open at both ends, which is basically like a market. Basically, she goes out in public. She's not in her house, in the environs of her house. She goes out in public. For a star, and her head, parua, is uncovered. But how's it uncovered? The ain aliyah redid. And she's not wearing a veil. K'chol hanashim, like women wear, or like women are supposed to wear. She's not wearing the veil. She goes out without wearing the veil. Af al pi, even though shisara mechuseh b'mitpachas, even though her hair is covered with a kerchief. In other words, her hair is still covered. She's wearing what we call today a tichel. Maybe even we wearing what we call today a sheitel. Her head is covered. Her hair is covered, but her face is not covered with the veil. Now, very important point. A lot of people are going to say, well, yes, Rambam is just another example of Rambam who spent all of his life in Islamic countries. He ran away from Spain. He ran to Morocco, who was pursued by the Almohads, then ran away to other places, eventually ended up in Egypt. So all his life he spent not really in Christian countries, but he spent in Islamic countries, and in Islamic culture, countries he was exposed to Islamic culture. Now that may or may not be the case, because Rambam codifies law and intends his law to be for all Jewish people. He knew that there weren't only Muslims in the world, that there wasn't only Muslim culture in the world. He knew there were other cultures, but he wrote his code because, and then you can say that everything in his Mishnah Torah was based on Islamic culture, which we know is not. It's obviously not. So it's not always accurate to say that Rambam was writing. Like, he may have, but he may not have. That's just a simple point I'm trying to make. He may, but he may not have. But nevertheless, he codifies in the Shulchan Aruch that women are supposed to wear a veil. So, according to the codification of, in his Mishnah Torah, according to the codification in the Mishnah Torah, women are supposed to wear veils, not just a scarf. Now, Rabbi Messes brings this as an example. And he says that the law obviously changed because Jewish women, except for a couple of them who still wear veils, in places like Mea Shearim today, you can still see them. The famous joke of someone asks his wife, "Where's your wife?" And he says, "Hine ba'ohel," here, like Abraham said about Sarah, she's in the tent. Anyway, that's just a joke. But we know that women don't, generally speaking, Jewish women do not wear veils. They wear head coverings, not veils. They'll cover their entire face. So Messer asks the question, how did it suddenly change? What suddenly changed? We have a codified law, whether we like it or not. We're not discussing whether it's right or wrong. We have a codified, it could just as well be X. How did it change? How did X suddenly change and become Y? And according to Rabbi Messes, it changed, having nothing to do with halakha whatsoever, or even with the halachic process whatsoever. The law changed simply because Jewish women were uncomfortable going out wearing the veil. They stopped wearing the veil. They neglected the codified law of wearing a veil, which they should have adhered to according to the codification. And because of their negligence or intended disregard for those laws, the rabbi sat with a problem. You're either going to antagonize half of the Jewish population, it's all of the Jewish women are going to become angry because you're going to say they're all sinners, or you try to find some way to justify why Jewish women don't have to wear a veil. That's what Rabbi Messes writes. And Rabbi Messes writes that they were driven not by a halachic need, not by consulting the books. They were driven by a practical problem. Jewish women stopped wearing the veil. They had to find some way to make it relatively acceptable, something else instead of the veil. But they were driven by the people, not by the law. It was pressure from the community, not created by the rabbis. And Messes presents the pragmatic dynamics of halachic decision-making that very few halachists would ever admit to. Very few people would admit that this is in fact what happened. It was driven from the bottom up, not from the top down. So let me quote you from Messes. Messes writes as follows. He says, "The people are the ones who abolish the practice little by little." Listen how forthright he is. He's almost as forthright as Shapiro himself. He says, the people are the ones who abolish the practice. Over here, talking about wearing a veil, little by little. At first, the rabbis of the time scream at them. I'm quoting from Yishayas and Shuvas. Shemesh Umagim. He writes, the rabbis scream at them first, but they, the people, do not pay attention. And little by little, it is abolished. So with time, less and less women wear the veil. The rabbis shout, they don't listen. The rabbis are getting nowhere. The rabbis are becoming ostracized. They're accused of living in another world. And slowly, it becomes permissible to wear a kerchief, a tichel, or a sheitel later. And it turns out the ones who established this custom are the people. They're the ones who begin to enact change. So let me read this sentence to you in Hebrew. It says, Nimtza, says Rabbi Messes. Nimtza, it comes out. You know, the bottom line is, Shimisha kovea minhag, that the party who fixes or establishes the custom of wearing a sheitel or a tichel, as opposed to the veil, Haim Hamon Ha'am, are the people. The people changed. Shehem hamatchilim l'shanot. They are the ones who began the change, not the rabbis. The change started with the people, in this case, with the women. The women were unhappy, they rebelled, they changed, and the halacha changed. Because the rabbis relied on halachic fictions to justify a negligence of Jewish law ex post facto once it had already become rooted within the community. And this is another example, I suppose, of a community's ritual instinct taking over as opposed to the rabbi's halachic instinct. But no poskim, says Mesas, would readily admit that this was the process. He's admitting it, but he knows that none of his colleagues would admit that this is how the process works. Because the rabbis usually prefer to frame change, especially halachic change, is rooted not in the people. How can you say it's rooted in the people? You're taking all the power away. It's not rooted in the people. The rabbis usually frame it as rooted in textual exegesis. The learned sages sit and they go through these tomes of books and they come up with things. They're using the legitimate halachic process, which they may in certain instances, but there are certainly other instances as well where that process does not take place and it's not driven by the rabbis, it's driven by the people. And Mesas exposes the mechanics that you often find in the halachic process, where it's not the rabbis who abolish the law, but it's the people who simply stop observing it, as simple as that. And then the law has to change. Shapiro says that this rabbinic approval that they now give once the masses have rebelled against the halacha is often ex post facto, it's retroactive, it's after the horse has already bolted. And there was nothing that the rabbis could do. As Messer said, in the beginning, they shout and scream, but no one listens to them, so they stop. And they adopt a different methodology. And Shapiro says, instead of approval, a better word would be toleration. You don't find like the rabbis give a heter and they approve it. Okay, it's okay. They throw up their hands, as it were, and they tolerate it. And that's how one needs to view some of these halachot. From a technical stance, the rabbis approved of the sheitel. They didn't. They tolerated the idea of not having a veil. They didn't necessarily approve of it. Obviously, with time, things changed. This was 800 years ago. But in the post-Shulchan Aruch period, which is a completely different era, now we have codified halacha that's accepted by Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, and it's the final go-to book. Shapiro says that we now await a detailed study of the halachic process. No one has done a detailed study on how halacha works. It's still applying the principles that we have from Talmudic times. And no one has really gone into the difference between the way we determine halacha today, post Shulchan Aruch, where we don't always go according to the Shulchan Aruch. No one has done a study. And what I would suggest is that Shapiro is one of the pioneers who actually is beginning to do the study that he claims has not really been done. how halacha is determined, especially in the era where we have a Shulchan Aruch, and we end up doing so many practices, observing so many practices that go against the Shulchan Aruch examples that we shall soon see. So I think that Shapira is a great pioneer. He acknowledges that work hasn't been done, but I think we need to acknowledge that he actually is doing that very work. Now, another example, because we explain these best with examples. Mezuzahs. Drive through a Jewish area today, anywhere in the world. Jewish houses, whether you're religious or not, generally have mezuzahs. I remember growing up where in my community, talking about our Bobbas and Zaydas who came from Lithuania, they came here, in this case South Africa, and the custom was to put up one mezuzah on the front door, and the mezuzah was a tiny mezuzah that probably if you opened up it wasn't all that kosher. Very small to out of kosher mezuzah. So it was a tiny little mezuzah, 3-4 centimeters high, very thin, couple of millimeters narrow, and that would be nailed in very inconspicuously on the right-hand side of your door. You still find some of these mezuzahs knocked up on the door frames of some of the old houses. But today, generally speaking, that same community has now large mezuzahs, huge mezuzahs on the door, all correctly affixed, and not only just on the front door, but on all the doors, on the side gates, on the back gates, on the storerooms, everywhere. If there's 4 gates, it's got 4 mezuzahs. There's mezuzahs everywhere. But we're going to see now that historically, what we see today is historically probably unprecedented. This wide observance of mezuzah. I mean, you can, thanks to Chabad, a lot of these changes have taken place. But we need to acknowledge that changes have taken place. Because if one goes into the history of the mezuzah, we see that the mezuzahs were not always as common as they are now. So let me not just say it, let me back this up with some historical evidence. So, particularly during medieval times, which everyone thinks this was the great time of we still had Rishonim, and everybody was keeping mitzvahs. Woe to us today, we don't keep mitzvahs. And then in those days they kept so much Torah and so much mitzvahs. But the fact of the matter is that it wasn't always the case, and certainly wasn't the case when it came to mezuzahs. So Rabbi Peretz, for example, is a 13th century. In fact, he died in 1295. So he died at exactly the same time as the Zohar first came out. Okay? So this is in that particular era. He's living, though, in Ashkenaz. And in what appears to be an early use of the notion of a halachic fiction, he justifies why you don't find many mezuzahs in Ashkenaz. Now, Ashkenaz is Germany and northern France in medieval times. So this is 13th, 14th century. Jews didn't put up many mezuzahs. Now, Peretz has to justify it because it's the same process as the veil. People stopped putting up mezuzot. There was widespread neglect. So what happens? You now need to justify why you don't need a mezuzah on every door, why you don't need so many mezuzah, why mezuzah isn't the most important mitzvah that you have to insist that every Jewish home has. So because of the neglect, he created a halachic fiction. In other words, he went back retroactively, ex post facto, took something that was neglected and explained it away halachically. And how did he do that? He mentions some obscure, and I haven't found the source for this, so I can't tell you if it exists, but there was the notion that in the Talmud Yerushalmi, it may exist. It actually makes no difference to our discussion whatsoever. I just haven't found the source. But apparently in the Talmud Yerushalmi, there is a saying somewhere that if you live in a city, if you live in a town where there are pigs, there just happen to be a couple of pigs in a town. People keep pigs, or the pigs walk through a town. People keep pigs. You don't need to put mezuzahs up if they're pigs in the area. So Rabbi Peretz was then saying, 13th century, he's saying the reason why we don't have mezuzahs. It's because in our towns, some of the people keep pigs. And therefore, no one needs to have mezuzahs. Clearly, that's a legal fiction. That because of the neglect, the people neglected, like they neglect so many things. They neglected the mezuzahs. There's a widespread neglect of lots of mitzvahs. There's a widespread neglect at that time, and we did a share on this. I think Rabbi Professor Conor Fogel speaks about the historic neglect of tefillin. We've dealt with this before. Not everyone put on tefillin the way we do today. Today, everyone's got tefillin, got 2 pairs of tefillin, everyone lots of tefillin. Wasn't always like this. There was a historical neglect of tefillin, probably even more than mezuzah. We just don't hear much about it. But because, in our case of the mezuzah, we see a legal fiction making what should be prohibited by the Shulchan Aruch. This was, by the way, 30 centuries. It would be before the Shulchan Aruch even came out. There was this widespread neglect. But nonetheless, even in those early days, he's relying on a legal fiction permitting what the community had been negligent of. A century later, Rabbi Yaakov Mullen, he's known as the Maharil, he passes away in 1427. And he writes, nothing changed about the neglect of the mezuzah. So now we're dealing with a period now of a century and more. There was neglect in Europe. The Maharil writes about that as well. It wasn't just Rabbi Peretz 100 and something years earlier. The Maharil writes now. But he's quite happy to say that there's a slight improvement. It's not great, but a slight improvement in mezuzah observance. But he notes that people are still negligent in putting mezuzahs up on all the doors of their homes. So there's still negligence, but now they might have 1 or 2 mezuzahs up. But still not like we see today. Like we think it's always been there. Everyone always had mezuzahs on all the doors of the house. That's the Maharil writing there. At the very same time, Rabbi Yisrael Isserlin, that's our third example now. He passed away in 1460, so that's the same time. He writes now from Austria. He's in Austria now. And he says, Ruva de Alma, the vast majority of Jews in Austria, including Torah scholars, not just people who neglect the law, but including Torah scholars, do not observe the custom of mezuzah on all their doors. Why? Because the legal fiction had kicked in and it became halakha. It became a custom, an accepted custom. Accepted custom becomes halakha. Sometimes a custom pushes aside halakha. And it became established. It shows the power of a legal fiction to go something that is actually against. Well, you can't say Shulchan Aruch because it didn't exist in the 1400s. Shulchan Aruch came 100 years later. But to go against halakha. Halakha requires mezuzahs on all the doors of your house. I'll give another example. Rav Moshe Isserles, known as the Ramah. Now he's in the time of Shulchan Aruch, obviously, because he writes the Haggah. He writes the Ashkenazi version of the Shulchan Aruch on Rabbi Yosef Karo's, the Mechaber's Shulchan Aruch, who wrote for Sfardim. So we have the Ramah being the Ashkenazi, writing the Ashkenazi version of the Shulchan Aruch for Rabbi Yosef Karo, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch for Sfardim. So it's a universal book on Jewish law. Rabbi Moshe Isserles, he's writing from Krakow, and he says as follows, that the practice is only to have 1 mezuzah. Look what he writes. He says, Rov ha'olam, the majority of the olam. Olam means the world. He's talking about the Jewish world. We talk about the olam means the Jewish religious world. Olam in our parlance is the frum Jewish world. The olam says, the olam. Rov ha'olam, stomchin al mezuzah achat, rely on 1 mezuzah. This is now the 1500s. Things actually got worse from the 13th century because the Rov ha'olam, most of the religious world, only relies on 1 mezuzah. So Abubas and Zaydas weren't necessarily wrong to put up 1 mezuzah. I'm not suggesting that you do that. I'm just saying that this is something that the Ramah had already noticed, which is fascinating. It's fascinating. And this was all, they were not regarded as doing something that was wrong. They were regarding as doing something that is quite personal, because Rov Ha'ilam, what more do you want? The vast majority of good God-fearing people they've got one mezuzah. You want to be better than them. So this just shows the power of this religious fiction that originally Rabbi Peretz had to rely on some obscure source saying if there are pigs around, you don't need a mezuzah. It became established. But he didn't do that based on legal precedent. He based that on observing the widespread negligence by the people. The people, again, these are other examples of the people informing halacha more than the rabbis. The rabbis react to it, and they retroactively, in some way or another, either accept, reject, or reconcile, as we saw with the standard practice of the people. But the people are very powerful in determining halacha, something that no halachist would ever admit. Along the same lines, we find a Tosafist. So still in the period of the Baalei HaTosafot, who asks a question. He sees that there's negligence in certain halacha, and his first question is, on what do they rely? What are they being somech on? What are they relying on? And you can already see now the workings of, or the early stirrings of halachic fiction. Because you can't accept that the law has been broken by a vast number of people. The halachas can never accept that, because that's giving up. So you always have to say, on what are they relying? If you've got a lot of people, and some of them are observant, or many of them are observant, in fact, most are observant, it depends how you're framing your oilam over here, but it seems that this Tosafist was asking about people that probably were observant people, but it doesn't really make any difference. He still believes that if the majority of people are doing it, they must be somech, they must be relying on something. And he asks, on what are they relying? You know, he's intimating that you've got to find something, a peg to hang that negligence on, to make it no longer negligence, to make it permissible. Because you can't have people living in a state of negligence. It's not good for Judaism. You've got to find some way to bring them into the fold and to make those practices relatively acceptable, maybe a few adaptations, to say, do it like this, do it with your left hand instead of your right hand, etc., etc. Do it with a shinoi. In some way or another, they create a legal fiction. Legal fiction becomes paramount in the securance of ongoing Jewish halakha. So you see this already in the question of the talk. What's it being somech on? If you can't find something, find something, but they've got to be somech on something. So we see that the behavior of the community often determines halakha once their behavior gets sanctioned retroactively by the halachist. Another example is the Jews of Germany never wore yarmulkes. A famous person, someone coming in to see Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. The story is that the person came to see him wasn't even wearing a yarmulke. But it was standard practice in Germany. But if you go back into the origins, the Jews didn't suddenly say, let's not wear yarmulkes. They stopped wearing yarmulkes, and as a result of legal fictions, saying, well, it was just a midat chasidut or Rav Huna who wore a yarmulke, but he was an exception. He was an exceptionally pious person. You don't really need to wear it. That wouldn't have been the case, because Jews would have covered their head. Women were wearing veils. Men would have covered their heads. To suddenly arrive at a situation where no, our minhag is not to wear a yarmulke. Clearly, that's the result of some form or another of legal fiction. That's the power of the people and the power of the legal fiction. But again, the rabbis were reluctant to admit this. They would be reluctant to admit that they endorsed practices that had been established by people who neglected to observe the halacha. So what do we find? We now find a genre of writing, and it's a dominant genre of writing, also absolutely fascinating, where I'm going to go through about three examples now. You're going to see the rabbis are endorsing the power of the people, lifting up the notion of the people, that even when they blatantly disregard halacha, that negligence assumes a certain sanctity by being retroactively admitted into the house of halacha. So one example, and this literature is well attested. You hear this to this very day. People say this with a very serious face. There's even the Gemara says, you want to know what the right halacha is, go out into the streets and see what the people are doing. Look at the people. That's also the first stirrings of the notion of a legal fiction. We know that the people don't determine halacha. The Gemara determines halacha. But now suddenly go out in the streets and see what the people are doing, and you determine your halacha by looking at the people. Yes, it's always determined because the people were so holy and good, but that's probably also a legal fiction. Go and see what the people are doing, because the people have the power of determining halacha, because the rabbis are going to come and they're going to adjust those practices, and those practices are going to become more norms. So you don't need to wear a veil, and you don't need to wear yarmulkes, and you can have Arabs, and you can have prosbulls, and all sorts of things. So here's one example. This is by Rabbi Eliyahu Ragola in his Yad Eliyahu, and he writes as follows. He says, "Damasha minag muskam," the fact that a custom is accepted Eitzel Klal Yisrael, by Klal Yisrael, it's by the body of Israel, the fact that the body of Israel listens to a minhag that's been widely accepted by Jews, Hu al pi ruach hakodesh. It's because the Jewish people as a nation have a collective form of ruach hakodesh, of prophecy. So they're steering the halacha in a certain direction. It's a kind of prophecy. Now this is astonishing, because when the rabbis realize they can no longer give musaf to the people who are neglecting to observe the halacha, suddenly the people assume this Baal Shem Tovia notion of the average person having this innate holiness, which is fine and beautiful, and even to the extent that they can determine halacha. The fact that a custom spreads amongst Jews, it's not an accident, but it's through the spirit of holiness. Okay, that's one example of this genre. Here's another case. This time it's from the Chida, Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai, the famous Chida. And he writes in Yosef Ometz as follows. He writes, "Shekol davar shehu murgal b'tzibur." Exactly the same thing. Everything that you see that is accepted or considered normative in a tzibur, in the community, not in the community of scholars, but in the tzibur, in the olam, in the world, in the Jewish world, ra'oi lismoch alav. It is appropriate to rely on it. So if you see a practice in the Jewish world that has been integrated into the Jewish world, ra'oi lismoch alav, it is appropriate to rely on it. Iluheim divrei navi, as if they were the words of a prophet. Again, in this genre, the people are not negligent, just like the first case, Ruach HaKodesh, divrei navi. It's the same idea, like two different people spanning different eras, talking about the notion of the Navi. There's the prophet in the people are the prophet. and something that's murgal, that just become part and parcel of community practice, even if it's a negligence of halacha. And in the post Shulchan Aruch, even of Shulchan Aruch, it's suddenly now the vision of, it's a prophetic vision steering halacha in a new direction. So what this amounts to is a practice of the Jewish community, as Shapiro puts it, often has a presumption of correctness. That's how he describes it. There's a presumption of correctness in what the average Jew does. And this is beautiful, on the one hand. On the other hand, it's incredibly dangerous because it means that Jews can get away with anything. There's a presumption of correctness. Jews would never do anything wrong in halakha. And there's a presumption of authoritativeness. So if people are doing it, especially in a religious community, if people are doing something, there's a presumption of correctness and of authoritativeness, even if it appears to be in opposition to accepted halakha. My goodness, that's one powerful statement. So it's like President Trump said, someone can shoot me in Fifth Avenue and I won't get arrested. So you can do anything. You can do anything, and there's this presumption of correctness and authoritativeness, even if it goes against halakha. Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik, I call him Chaim because we spell him with an H. He's the great grandson of the Brisker Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik. So this is the contemporary Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik. He says, once the existing becomes identified with appropriate, he's saying something simpler. Once the existing status quo in the Jewish community is identified as appropriate, because everyone's doing it, so therefore it must be okay. Now he adds in an interesting thing. Chaim Soloveitchik is an interesting person, and he speaks with a certain academic authority as well. He says, as it does in every vibrant traditional society. Look what he's saying. It's not only Jews who identify the existing as appropriate. What you see is good. What you see, how you see Jews behaving is how Jews are supposed to behave. This is right. This is halachic. If you see a frum community doing things, there's this presumption that what they're doing is right. Soloveitchik says that this is not unique to the Jewish people. It's unique to every traditional society. See, so like a typical academic, he's framing this contextually. He's saying every traditional society, you go to Africans in Africa, you go to Indians, you go anywhere in the world where there's a traditional society, what they do becomes standard practice and becomes okay. The existing is identified with the appropriate. It becomes appropriate. If it exists, it's appropriate because that's what the people do. And this identity can easily spill over, says Soloveitchik, and legitimize practices that fall beyond the halachic perimeter. Oh my goodness, he's saying again here. And that's true of Judaism as well. We behave just like any other traditional community, although we think we don't. We think a lot of things sometimes, but every traditional community behaves like or thinks like this. We think like this as well. But the problem over here is that sometimes we have this assumption of correctness that allows us to accept things that are prohibited by halakha. And something that's noted as well by Soloveitchik, not just by Shapiro. Now the question is, how can halakha change if it's unchangeable? Halakha is supposed to be unchangeable. Go in the street and ask any person, ask any rabbi, does halakha change? And 99% will say, no, halakha can't change. It's immutable. It's never changed. What you see now is how it's always been. Halakha doesn't change. We adapt a little bit, but essentially it doesn't change. Handed down from father to son, there is no change. I've heard this all my life. There's no change. Nothing changes. But how can halakha change? Because we see that it does seem to change. And it changes in both directions. It changes because sometimes we institute new laws. We sometimes become frummer. We have more chumras. We institute new observances, new minhagim, make life more complicated for ourselves, more chumras. But also sometimes we abolish old practices. So the change. It's a two-way street. It's going in both directions. But halacha is supposed to be immutable. It's supposed to be not subject to change, but it does appear to change. So now, what do we do with this? So if you ask what I would call some of the hardliners, I don't want to use the word people who've been radicalized, so I won't. But if you look at some of the hardliners, and maybe let's frame it a little bit better, the staunch conservative guardians of halachic tradition. An example of this, and I can give you many examples. One of these is Rabbi David Blach. He writes a lot of halakha. I've got all of his volumes on my bookshelf over here on halakha. He's a great halachist. But he declares that Jewish law does not change. That is the quote. In inverted commas, Jewish law does not change. This is from David Blach. Jewish law does not change. Now this flies in the face of everything that we've just said. I mean, we've seen there's neglected, change, lots of change. I mean, the veils, not veils, there's so many changes, and I'll give you more examples there soon as we close down. But he categorically states that Jewish law does not change. So now we have a problem. What do we do with this? You want to follow that path? We told it, father to son, nothing changes. So what do we do? Because if we apply our minds, we know that historically, if we study history, the neglect of so many mitzvahs, the changing of so many things like mezuzahs, etc. How do you understand these changes? I mean, did they not happen? Is it nonsense? So look what Shapiro says, because this is one case where I'd rather quote Shapiro than say it myself. Shapiro says, and I quote, while Blind's approach might make good dogma, it's bad history. So I'm happy to have that approach because I can still remain very respectful. Shapiro says, not me, Shapiro says that Blind's approach, by saying that Jewish law does not change, makes fantastic dogma. It's great dogma. It's great religious dogma. Now, people are thirsty for that. I want the straight and narrow. I believe this, I don't believe that. I want to put it in a box. It's great dogma, but it's bad history because it doesn't gel with history. It's not factual. It's simply not true historically. Yet again, Blach isn't the only person. Many rabbis remain uncompromisingly adamant in denying that halachic changes have ever occurred. And once again, especially in our time, when we already have a Shulchan Aruch, that becomes a bigger problem. So let's go quickly through a couple of examples to see how the halacha that we accept today has gone against what's written explicitly in the Shulchan Aruch. Let's start over here, quick. One example. Shulchan Aruch says, Orach Chaim, Chafei. Orach Chaim. Shulchan Aruch says that immediately on putting on the hand tefillin. So you put on your hand tefillin, you roll up your sleeves, you put on your shel yad. Right. You put the box on your shel yad. You haven't yet started winding it on your hand. You've just put it on your hand. So you say the bracha you put on your hand, it's here. It's on at the upper part of your arm. Yeah. You've just placed it there. What's the next step? So we know we carry on winding to our wrist and then we put on our head tefillin. No, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't say that. He says you put the box on your arm and before winding the strap around your arm, you put on the head tefillin. So it's immediate. Shel yad on the arm and immediately on the head. Boom. The winding then comes later. This is not the standard practice today. Our standard practice today goes against the Shulchan Aruch. Okay. Now somebody says, oh, what's the difference? It makes a big difference because standard practice, something as important as tefillin, should not be connected to Shulchan Aruch. what's going on? The truth is, we know that the Arizal came on the scene and introduced the Kabbalistic notion that you've got to do the winding before you put on any head tefillin. But still, we accept a Kabbalistic tradition over a clear halachic tradition in the Shulchan Aruch. Again, that's the form. You could say it's a halachic fiction. I'm not suggesting it's a fiction, but you're relying on something to go against the stated ruling of the Shulchan Aruch. It's now okay. You found a peg to hang it. That's your legal fiction. And we're using Kabbalah in this sense as a legal fiction to say, no, it's okay. It's like saying you don't have mezuzahs in a town where there's pigs. You don't admit that you're changing it. You're changing. In this case, it's not really neglect. You can't compare this to the neglect of mezuzahs, but it is still a change in the halacha. But it's a change based on a precedent. What's the precedent? Perhaps from a halachic point of view, a shaky Kabbalistic idea as opposed to something that's well rooted in the Shulchan Aruch, because we go against the Shulchan Aruch when it comes to the way we put on tefillin. Another example is Kriya. When someone passes away, the family members tear their shirts. According to the Shulchan Aruch, and it's not disputed by the Ramah, so it means it's the universal law. Ashkenazim and Sfaradim agree that the immediate family, that Kriya, according to the Shulchan Aruch and agreed to by the Ramah, is performed not only by the members of the family, but it's actually performed by the people who were present when the person passed away. So you could be a stranger on a bus. You'd have to do Kriya. That's the universal law as agreed to by the Ramah and Rabbi Yosef Karo in the Shulchan Aruch. So the universal Jewish law is those who are present at the moment of the person's passing tear Kriya. We don't do that today. Again, that's another practice that departs from the Shulchan Aruch, but it's become a standard practice. It's astonishing. The list goes, I'm just giving you a couple of examples. There's so many instances where we go completely away from what is written in the Shulchan Aruch, and it's absolutely acceptable. According to the Shulchan Aruch, another example, if a man's not married by the age of 20, the Beit Din can force him to get married. Okay? That might solve the shidduch crisis. But that's what the Shulchan Aruch says. This is one law that apparently has never been applied. But still, it says that in Shulchan. And again, I'm not saying it's right, it's wrong. I'm just saying that that's another instance of a law in the Shulchan Aruch that's been completely neglected. But here's a fascinating example. Times of Shabbos. Now, this is very, very important for people who are from Shabbos. There's a halachic dispute as to when Shabbos begins and when Shabbos ends. So to put it in a nutshell, Rabbeinu Tam maintains that Shabbos starts and ends later. He has a later time for the commencement and the departure of Shabbos. So Rabbeinu Tam brings Shabbos in later and takes Shabbos out later on a Saturday night, and brings Shabbos in later on a Friday night. So for Rabbeinu Tam, Shabbos starts and ends later. The Gaonim argue with Rabbeinu Tam, and they bring Shabbos in early and they conclude Shabbos early. So it's a machloket. Rabbeinu Tam, Shabbos starts and ends later. Gaonim, Shabbos starts and ends earlier. All right? And it's a significant difference in time. Now, the Shulchan Aruch sides with Rabbeinu Tam. That Shabbos starts later and ends later. It's Orach Chaim, Chavav. Shabbos starts later and ends later. Doesn't side with the Gaonim that it starts earlier, it starts later. Yet we know that the universal practice today is that we bring Shabbos in according to the time of the Gaonim, which is earlier, and it goes out earlier. And we're completely going against the ruling in the Shulchan Aruch, which holds like Rabbeinu Tam that it should start and end later. So where's our legal fiction? What do we rely on to suddenly break away from the Shulchan Aruch? So again over here, we rely on two people, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the Alter Rebbe, first Rebbe of Chabad, as well as the Vilna Gaon, so from the Hasidim and the Mitnagdim, support the notion of the earlier time. So based on them, that becomes our ticket or our legal fiction, if we can use that term in the sense, to neglect a explicit ruling in Shulchan Aruch and bring Shabbos in and complete at a completed time. And the ramifications of this are astonishing. Let me read to you what Rabbi Shlomo Sternberg writes. He says, we're in a strange situation as far as one of the most fundamental issues of halacha is concerned, the onset of Shabbos. Okay, this is serious. Universal Jewish practice today is contrary to the explicit reading of the Shulchan Aruch. Listen to that sentence. The universal Jewish practice of Shabbos today is contrary to the explicit reading of the Shulchan Aruch. We're all going completely against the Shul. We're bringing Shabbos in when it's not Shabbos, and we're letting Shabbos out when it's still Shabbos. We also know that the universal practice today is contrary to the common practice in Eastern Europe in the 19th century. Not only are we going against what the Shulchan Aruch says, we're going against what our immediate ancestors in the 19th century, they brought Shabbos in according to the later time, not according to the earlier time. So what we're doing by bringing into early time goes against not only Shulchan Aruch, it goes against what our Bobas and Zaydas did. Accordingly, most people today, says Rabbi Sternberg, do melacha, if they break Shabbos, on Motzei Shabbos, on a Saturday night, because they let it out too early, at a time when, according to most Rishonim and the Shulchan Aruch, okay, according to most Rishonim and the Shulchan regarding something as important as Shabbos, they break Shabbos because they've done Baruch HaMavdil, and now they're even doing Havdalah in celebration of them doing melachas of Shabbos, and constitutes a Shabbos violation published by the biblical penalty of skila, of stoning. All right, I'm not suggesting this time, people, but we see over here that in halachic terms we're playing with fire. Then how do we do it? It's probably more convenient to bring Shabbos in earlier than to bring later. No one wants Shabbos to go into late on a Saturday night. People have got things to do. Okay, Shabbos afternoon, you've already resigned Shabbos afternoon to be not such a productive time. So you bring a bit earlier, it doesn't really affect you. But on Saturday night, you want to have a malamalka, you want to go out, so what do we base ourselves on? We base ourselves on a legal fiction to get out of the stricter view of having Shabbos start later and particularly end later. All right, so I think we can conclude with this. There's the notion, just maybe just one last thing, just to show you how there was always, I'll show you how another way that the legal fiction was used, when they couldn't actually pinpoint it, when they couldn't say they're relying on the Alter Rebbe and the Vilna Gaon, or they couldn't say they were relying on pigs in a city. What they did is they would use the word oilam, and Shapiro points this out. Whenever a person says, if you have a halachic debate with someone and says, no, but the oilam does this, or the oilam says, which is something, the guy bangs the stem and says, but the oilam says, and then everyone sits back and says, the oilam says, as if God came down on Mount Sinai and gives us a ruling. Who's this oilam? There's no such thing as this oilam. It's what we touched upon in the beginning. But a clue to when a legal fiction is being used is that when you can't actually find an excuse, you then create a fictional halachic fiction, where you refer to this elusive oilam. The oilam holds as something you often find in yeshivische sprach, the way people speak. It's the street speak. There's this notion of this authoritative oilam somewhere, I mean, one man's olam is different from another, but nonetheless, this is often a clue that a legal fiction has been used. And Shapiro goes and again sort of digs in a little bit deeper, and he says that if you want to use the word olam, we use olam to show that the authoritative, elusive olam exists somewhere. Shapiro says no. If you want to use the word olam authoritatively or correctly, the olam were the people who broke with the law. Because the olam stopped putting up mezuzahs, the olam stopped doing all sorts of things. And then the rabbis retroactively changed it. So we use the word olam so incorrectly because the olam got us into the trouble in the first place. So ironically, we use that same olam when we can't find an excuse, when we can't find a fiction, we create another fiction on top of the fiction. We call it the olam. But it's such a bad term because the olam got us into the hot water in the first place. Because we followed their neglect, even at the price of the Shulchan Aruch. Shapiro says, the masses do what they like. This is the olam. And then the halachists come and they justify those deviations ex post facto. That's a quote from Shapiro. I think this summarizes everything that we have been saying. So this is halachic fiction, the notion of halachic fiction that allows halacha to adapt formally without changing its principles. You can still keep your principles. You can still say you're relying on the principles of Torah because you've created these halachic fictions. It creates a framework for people who don't realize it, that the law is consistent. And you have people who can then stand up and say the law never ever changes, because the olam, the halachic fictions create that sense of authority. And it accommodates the real needs of the world. You can't fight the world. A halachic fiction is technically artificial, but it is still halachically valid. It's still legally valid. If you can create a halachic fiction, you can use it, and people do use it. So a halachic fiction can and is a very strong mechanism. But studying the history of halachic change, once again, flies in the face of a real historic study of Jewish history, where there has been neglect based on the populace not wanting to keep these strict laws anymore. And the halachic fictions coming in to somehow reconcile where possible. Sometimes they were rejected, sometimes they were accepted, but sometimes, if you remember from the beginning of third auction, they were reconciled. They are often reconciled. And that's where the halachic fiction becomes its most creative. So halachic fiction illustrates how Jewish law, especially in the post-Shulchan Aruch era, where we have a codified book and these things should not be happening, where Jewish law creatively negotiates between law and everyday reality, while portraying the resultant changes as having always been there in the system, pretending that these changes have always been there and that nothing has changed. They have been inherent in the system all along. And this gives power and authority to the halachic fiction. I thank you so much for listening and look forward to seeing you again next time.